A woman finds an abandoned baby and cares for it, but the situation takes a turn when the father finds them. If you love heartwarming and emotional stories, don't miss this incredible tale. Subscribe now and stay tuned. Anneke adjusted the scarf around her neck, trying to shield herself from the biting wind sweeping through Amsterdam's empty streets. The city, usually so vibrant, seemed suspended in the frozen stillness of that winter night. The clock on the local church tower was nearing midnight, and Anneke had just finished an exhausting 12-hour shift at the hospital. Despite her fatigue, her walk through Vondelpark was a habit she had grown to cherish, a moment to unwind before finally heading home. Her footsteps echoed against the damp pavement, and the cold air turned her breath into small clouds of mist. As a nurse, Anneke was used to facing all manner of situations during her long hours at work: emergencies, grateful patients, others in despair. But she never could have imagined that something extraordinary was waiting for her that night. As she approached a wooden bench illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp, something caught her eye. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a forgotten bundle, a blanket, carelessly left behind by someone passing through. But then, a faint sound broke the silence, a cry, so soft it was almost imperceptible. Anneke froze, her heart racing. Taking cautious steps forward, she knelt by the bench and gently tugged at the edge of the blanket. There he was, a baby. Tiny and fragile, his eyes were shut tight, his face flushed red from the cold. He let out weak cries, as if he no longer had the strength to protest against his circumstances. "Oh my God," Anneke whispered, a shiver running through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Her professional instincts kicked in. Carefully, she wrapped the baby in her coat and held him close to her chest. He was alive, but the cold could still claim him if she didn't act fast. Without hesitation, Anneke pulled out her phone and called the hospital, explaining the emergency as she hurried towards her bike, parked just a few meters away. As she pedaled through the deserted streets, Anneke couldn't shake the thought, who could abandon a child like this? She tried to push away her anger and judgment, focusing instead on what needed to be done. Every second mattered. At the hospital, the team was ready and waiting. Anneke quickly explained what had happened, and the baby was whisked away for medical evaluation. She stayed close by, watching her colleagues work, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? Why had he been left there? Would anyone come looking for him? Hours later, the baby, now clean and warm, was sleeping peacefully in one of the hospital's nurseries. Anneke sat on a bench in the corridor, unable to bring herself to leave. Something about the child's serene expression stirred a deep, inexplicable connection within her. She felt responsible. The next morning, Anneke decided to take action. With the hospital administration's permission, she began personally caring for the baby while authorities investigated the case. He needed a name, at least for now. Jurre, she decided, inspired by a character from a Dutch children's book she had loved as a child. Over the following days, Anneke became increasingly attached to him. Jurre seemed to thrive under her care, responding to her affection with tiny smiles that warmed something inside her she hadn't realized was so cold and empty. Yet Anneke knew this arrangement was temporary. If his biological family wasn't found, Jurre would be placed into the care of child protection services. The thought of saying goodbye to him weighed heavily on her heart. But was it her place to intervene, or was it? That freezing night in the park had changed everything, and Anneke had no idea just how much her life was about to be transformed. Anneke begins to question her role in Jurre's life as the investigation progresses. The idea of adoption, something she had never considered before, emerges as a risky but tempting possibility. But was she ready to fight for him? Would she be willing to take on a responsibility that could alter both their lives forever? In the days following her encounter with Jurre, Anneke tried to maintain focus on her hospital routine, but the growing bond with the little boy was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just another patient, there was something special about him. Every smile he gave her, every time his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, Anneke felt her life intertwining with his in ways she couldn't have foreseen. Authorities still had no leads on Jurre's family. No matches in the databases. No missing child reports. The story of the abandoned baby was beginning to fade from local news, but Anneke couldn't simply move on. Jurre needed someone. He needed her. One afternoon, during a hospital break, Anneke sat with Miriam, an older and more experienced colleague. Miriam, sensing Anneke's inner turmoil, placed a cup of coffee in her hands. "You're thinking about Jurre, aren't you?" Miriam asked gently. Anneke sighed, taking a sip of the warm coffee. "I can't stop thinking about him. He's so small, so vulnerable. And no one's come forward. It's as though he's been erased from the world." Miriam regarded her with empathetic eyes. "Have you considered that maybe he was meant to cross your path? Sometimes, we don't choose our paths, they choose us." Miriam's words lingered in Anneke's mind. That night, back at home, she began researching the adoption process in the Netherlands. It wasn't simple. The process could take months, sometimes years, of evaluations, interviews, and endless paperwork. On top of that, she'd need to prove she was financially stable enough to raise a child. Her nurse's salary covered her living expenses, but adding a baby into the mix would stretch her budget thin. Still, Anneke couldn't shake the idea. The next morning, she requested a meeting with the hospital director. With her colleagues' support, she gained permission to apply as a temporary guardian for Jurre while social services investigated the possibility of adoption. Anneke's days became a balancing act of work and makeshift motherhood. After long shifts, she would spend hours caring for Jurre, feeding him, changing nappies, and singing him to sleep. The hospital even allowed her to take him home on weekends, a gesture that only deepened the bond between them. But the weight of responsibility soon made itself known. There were nights when Jurre wouldn't stop crying, and Anneke, exhausted, would cry alongside him. She began questioning whether she was truly ready to be a mother, especially under such unexpected circumstances. One particularly tough afternoon, as Jurre battled a fever, Anneke found herself overwhelmed by doubt. "What if I'm not enough?" she wondered. But when she held his tiny hand and felt the warmth of his touch, she knew she couldn't give up. The moment Anneke made her final decision came on a sunny winter's day. She was walking with Jurre in a small park near the hospital. Wrapped in a soft blue blanket, he stared in wide-eyed wonder at the bird soaring across the sky. Watching him, Anneke was struck by his resilience, even after such a difficult start in life. She stopped, cradling him closer, and whispered, "I'm going to do this. I'll fight for you." With her heart resolute, Anneke officially began the adoption process. She knew it would be an uphill battle, meetings with social workers, juggling work and the demands of motherhood, unexpected expenses, but she was determined to give Jurre the home he deserved. The road ahead would be challenging, but Anneke was certain it was the right one. Anneke and Jurre embark on a new chapter of their lives in Haarlem, striving to build a future together. But will their bond be strong enough to overcome the challenges that lie ahead? Anneke gazed at the small apartment in Haarlem with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. It was modest yet cozy, windows overlooking a peaceful canal, a simple living room with just enough space for Jurre's needs, and a bedroom she had lovingly transformed into a welcoming nursery. The wooden crib, surrounded by soft toys she had picked up at local markets, gave the room a warmth that reflected her intentions. Moving to Haarlem felt like a necessary step. The city was quieter than Amsterdam, offering Jurre a more tranquil childhood. The proximity to the hospital where Anneke worked also simplified her routine, a balance she desperately needed. The first days were full of adjustment. Now officially Jurre's foster mother, Anneke felt the responsibility as both a weight and a privilege. Each morning, she would prepare the stroller and head out for walks along the canals. Haarlem's charm captivated her, weekly markets where she bought fresh fruit and flowers, and narrow streets where she began to feel part of a community. Jurre seemed to thrive in their new surroundings. His curious eyes followed the boats gliding through the water, and his babbling sounds of delight filled Anneke with joy. Every smile was a reassurance of her decision. Even with sleepless nights and financial challenges, Anneke felt she was doing the right thing. A routine gradually emerged. On her days off, Anneke would secure Jurre into the child's seat on her bike and cycle through the cobbled streets, pointing out Haarlem's treasures, St. Bavo's Church, cozy cafes, and parks where children played. Life was simple, yet every moment felt rich with meaning. Evenings became a time for connection. Anneke established a bedtime ritual, reading beloved Dutch children's books like Pluk van de Petterflet. Jurre, mesmerized by the colorful illustrations, would stare intently as she read. Anneke often wondered if he would ever understand how much these quiet moments helped her as much as they did him. But not everything was idyllic. Anneke faced daily struggles. The cost of raising a child on her own was higher than she had anticipated, and she frequently worried about bills and unexpected expenses. Social programs provided some support, but there were moments when the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm her. Then there were the questions, the ones she knew would eventually come. As Jurre grew, so did his curiosity. He began babbling sounds that resembled words, pointing to the pictures around their home, trying to piece together his world. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, Jurre looked up at Anneke and said something that sounded startlingly close to Mama. Her heart swelled with warmth, yet a knot of concern tightened in her chest. She knew that one day she would have to explain the truth of his origins. That conversation loomed in the distance, a shadow she wasn't yet ready to confront. Still, the tender moments outweighed the challenges. Anneke began to realize that this wasn't just her and Jurre building a new life, it was life reshaping her. And as she cycled home one sunny afternoon, with Jurre giggling in the child seat behind her, Anneke felt something she hadn't in a long time, a sense of near happiness. At the hospital, a new doctor, Martin, joins the team. His unexpected arrival will not only bring surprises but also threaten the stability of the new life Anneke and Jurre are building together. Anneke was organizing patient files in the hospital when she overheard a conversation in the corridor about a new doctor joining the team. Martin de Vries, they said, highly competent, from Utrecht. Her curiosity was piqued, but she quickly returned to her tasks. The hospital had a high turnover of staff, and new faces were nothing unusual. However, when Martin walked into the staff lounge for the first time to introduce himself, Anneke felt a sudden shift within her. He was tall, with light brown hair and a serious yet approachable demeanor. When they formally exchanged greetings, his calm, almost reserved energy caught her attention. "Nice to meet you," he said, shaking her hand. The interaction was brief, but it lingered. What Anneke didn't realize was that this encounter would set off a series of events that would drastically alter the life she was building with Jurre. A few days later, during a quick break, Anneke ran into Martin again. This time, he initiated a conversation, curious about her long tenure at the hospital. Their chat flowed naturally, and Martin seemed genuinely interested in getting to know the team. But then, during the casual exchange, he mentioned something that stopped Anneke in her tracks. "Actually, I spent some years in Amsterdam," he said. "It was a confusing time for me, I'll admit, and I left a lot behind." There was a faint hesitation in his voice, but Anneke didn't dwell on it. The hospital was too busy for her to process the comment further. Fate, however, seemed determined to bring their paths closer. A few days later, Martin stepped into the pediatrics wing, where Anneke was tending to Jurre. It was one of the rare times she had brought him to the hospital. An emergency shift had left her with no other childcare options. "What a beautiful baby," Martin remarked as he approached. "Is he yours?" Anneke hesitated for a moment. "Well, yes," she replied, her voice faltering before clarifying. "In a way. I recently adopted him." Martin smiled, but his expression changed the moment he looked more closely at Jurre. His eyes lingered on the child's face, studying the features intently. For a fleeting moment, Anneke saw his smile fade, replaced by a look of shock. "What's his name?" Martin asked, his tone quieter now. "Jurre," Anneke said cautiously, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Martin swallowed hard, shaking his head slightly as though trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "Can you tell me how he came to be here?" Unsure of what to think, Anneke briefly recounted the story of finding Jurre abandoned in an Amsterdam park. Martin listened intently, and when she finished, his face was a mix of disbelief and something deeper, pain. "Anneke," he began, his voice trembling, I think he might be my son." Anneke froze. "What? That's impossible." Martin, visibly shaken, explained that years ago, he had a brief relationship in Amsterdam but lost touch with the woman. He never knew she was pregnant, but now the child's features bore an uncanny resemblance to his own family. Anneke was incredulous. The coincidence seemed too far-fetched, and part of her wanted to dismiss the possibility entirely. Yet something in Martin's eyes, a blend of hope and regret, made her pause. Over the following days, the two embarked on a delicate process. A DNA test was ordered, and the waiting period was agonizing. Anneke found herself torn. She feared losing Jurre, but also knew she had to act in his best interests. When the results arrived, confirming that Martin was indeed Jurre's biological father, Anneke felt as though the ground had been pulled from beneath her. "I want to be part of his life," Martin said firmly but with a tone of respect. "I didn't know he existed, but now that I do, I can't walk away." Anneke looked at him, a whirlwind of emotions brewing inside her. Why had fate brought Martin into their lives now, just as things were beginning to feel stable? Anneke and Martin must confront the inevitable: how to share responsibility for Jurre without disrupting the world she has built for him. Can they find common ground, or will this turn into a battle for custody over the boy? The silence in the hospital's meeting room was stifling. Anneke and Martin sat across from each other, their nerves palpable. Between them was a social worker, tasked with mediating the situation. The DNA test had confirmed Martin's suspicions, giving him legal rights to Jurre. Yet Anneke felt as though her world was crumbling. The boy she loved as her own now had another connection she couldn't ignore. "I'm not here to take him away from you, Anneke," Martin began, his tone measured, attempting to ease the tension. "I just want to be part of his life." "Part of his life?" Anneke shot back, her voice trembling with frustration. "You weren't there when he was abandoned. You weren't there when he fought against the cold and hunger. You show up now, after everything is settled." The social worker interjected gently. "Let's keep this constructive. The goal is to find a balance that's in Jurre's best interest." The days that followed were filled with meetings, confrontations, and difficult decisions. Anneke and Martin began exploring how they might share responsibility for Jurre, but the process was anything but straightforward. They had conflicting ideas about what was best for the boy. Martin wanted to ease his way into Jurre's life, while Anneke feared that even gradual changes could unsettle him. At 2 years old, Jurre couldn't grasp the events unfolding around him, but he seemed to sense the tension in the adult's behavior. He became more irritable, crying more often, which broke Anneke's heart. The breaking point came one afternoon when Martin visited Anneke to discuss the next steps. He brought a gift for Jurre, a small wooden car he had crafted himself. Jurre accepted the gift but clung to Anneke, glancing at Martin with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "He's not used to you," Anneke said, her voice betraying her exhaustion. "You want him to accept you, but that takes time." "I know it takes time," Martin replied, striving to stay calm. "But if we don't start somewhere, he'll never get to know me." The tension boiled over. "And what if you leave again?" Anneke snapped. "How will I explain that to him?" "Anneke," Martin countered, his tone firm yet wounded, "I'm not the same person I was years ago. I'm not walking away this time." At that moment, Jurre, engrossed in his new toy, began to giggle as he pushed the car along the floor. His laughter broke the heavy atmosphere, and both adults watched him in silence, reminded of the reality they faced. Anneke knew Martin wasn't to blame for Jurre's abandonment, but the thought of sharing the boy's love was almost unbearable. Gradually, their clashes gave way to moments of understanding. Anneke started to see that Martin wasn't trying to take her place but was seeking a role in Jurre's life. He attended supervised visits, showing patience and a willingness to learn Jurre's routines and needs. Still, doubts lingered in Anneke's mind. One evening, as she tucked Jurre into bed, she whispered to herself, "Am I doing the right thing? Am I putting his needs above my fears?" Finally, Anneke and Martin decided to have an honest conversation without mediators. Sitting at a cafe overlooking the canal, Martin opened up about his life and past mistakes. "I didn't know I had a son," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "And when I found out, it felt like everything in my life shifted. But, Anneke, I know you've been everything to him when he needed it most. I don't want to take that away from you." Anneke, moved by his sincerity, began to let down her guard. She saw that Martin was also trying his best. But that didn't mean the journey ahead would be easy. As Anneke and Martin work to find common ground, a decisive moment arises that forces them to set aside their differences for Jurre's sake. Can they come together to provide the boy with the home he deserves? Anneke's small apartment was silent that evening. Jurre slept peacefully in the room next door, soothed by the gentle melody of a music box. Seated at the kitchen table, Anneke stared at a shared custody document suggested by the social worker. Each word felt heavy, laden with implications. The very idea of sharing responsibility for Jurre with Martin felt like relinquishing part of the bond she had fought so hard to create. The following morning, Anneke met Martin at the park where their supervised visits usually took place. He was kneeling beside Jurre, helping him build a tower of blocks. The scene was almost serene, but Anneke couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to unfold. "We need to talk," Anneke said, motioning for Martin to step away while Jurre played under the watchful eye of a babysitter. "I know," he replied, his expression a mixture of weariness and resolve. Anneke took a deep breath before continuing. "I don't want this to turn into a legal battle. I don't want Jurre to grow up caught between two people who can't find common ground." Martin nodded, his gaze falling to the ground. "Neither do I. But he's my son, Anneke. I need to be part of his life." Martin's words echoed in Anneke's mind, and for the first time, she realized she needed to reassess her own motivations. Was her attachment to Jurre a way of protecting him, or was it rooted in fear of losing the place he had carved out in her life? The turning point came on a particularly difficult day. While playing in the park, Jurre fell and scraped his knee. His cries of distress made Anneke sprint towards him, but before she could reach him, Martin was already there. He cradled the boy gently, soothing him. "Sure, it's okay, little one," Martin said, his voice soft and reassuring. He cleaned Jurre's knee with a handkerchief and kissed it lightly, just as Anneke would have done. Jurre, still sniffling, buried his face in Martin's shoulder. It was the first time Anneke had seen her son seek comfort from someone other than her. The moment was bittersweet, painful yet illuminating. Later, as Martin took Jurre to the doctor to ensure the injury wasn't serious, Anneke remained in the park, alone. The cold wind seemed to whisper truths she had been avoiding. Jurre wasn't hers alone. He had the right to be loved by both of them. That evening, Anneke invited Martin over for a definitive conversation. "We can't keep going like this," she began. "Jurre needs stability, and we need to stop fighting each other." Martin nodded in agreement. "I just want him to be happy. If that means finding a way to work together, then I'm willing." Anneke looked into his eyes, seeing for the first time not a rival but someone who shared the same profound love for Jurre. "Let's make this work," she said, extending her hand. Martin took her hand, and in that simple gesture lay their shared commitment. They decided to share responsibilities, but more importantly, to approach parenthood as a team. The weeks that followed were challenging but transformative. Anneke and Martin began building a co-parenting model that balanced their routines. They started sharing moments with Jurre, strolls along the canals, trips to the market, and afternoons at home. At first, it was awkward, but gradually, a sense of unity began to emerge. The emotional climax came one evening when Jurre reached out his arms, asking both Anneke and Martin to hold him at the same time. They exchanged a look, then laughed as they scooped him up together. In that moment, it felt as though all the tension and uncertainty had finally been left behind. With their decision made, Anneke and Martin now faced the challenges of building a new family dynamic. Will their shared love for Jurre be enough to unite the two people he needs most in his life? The morning was bright, and the sound of bicycles filled the peaceful streets of Haarlem. Anneke and Martin walked side by side, pushing Jurre's pram. It was an ordinary day, yet it carried the weight of something extraordinary. A new routine was taking shape, one they had built together. Jurre, seated in his pram, watched the ducks in the canal with wide-eyed curiosity. His innocence was a stark contrast to the long journey Anneke and Martin had navigated to reach this moment. The tension of recent months had given way to a cautious but functional coexistence. They had agreed that Martin would take a more active role during weekends, while Anneke remained Jurre's primary caregiver. Gradually, Martin became part of bedtime reading routines and morning strolls. In turn, Anneke began including him in major decisions about Jurre, something she had once thought impossible. A pivotal moment occurred during a boat ride along the canals. Martin had organized the outing as a gesture of unity, and Anneke, initially hesitant, agreed. As she watched Jurre giggle and point at the colorful canal houses, she realized she was beginning to trust Martin. That day, upon returning home, Anneke did something she never thought she would. "Martin, would you like to stay for dinner?" she asked, surprised by how natural the words felt. He accepted, and as the three of them shared a simple meal, Anneke realized this was more than just dinner, it was the start of something bigger. Over time, Anneke and Martin found a balance, not just for Jurre, but with each other. Conversations that had once been tense grew more open. Small gestures of empathy, like Martin bringing flowers to thank Anneke for her patience or her encouraging him to teach Jurre to ride a bike, began to strengthen their bond. The greatest transformation, however, was in Jurre. He seemed more confident, more joyful. Anneke knew it was because he felt surrounded by love and security. Their journey wasn't just about building a family, it was about learning to let go of pride, embrace vulnerability, and always prioritize Jurre's needs. Anneke, once so protective, discovered that sharing love didn't diminish it, it multiplied it. Martin, in turn, learned that being a father wasn't just a right but a daily commitment requiring effort and care. One sunny afternoon, as the three of them cycled through the park, Anneke glanced at Martin and then at Jurre. For the first time, she felt she wasn't alone, they were a team. Life hadn't gone as she had planned, but destiny had shown her that some stories end better than any plan ever could. As the sun set over Haarlem's canals, Anneke whispered to herself, "We're exactly where we're meant to be." If you've made it to the end, don't forget to subscribe and leave your like so you won't miss more heartwarming stories.